Hello and welcome to this podcast about 1691, one of the most significant years in Irish history. My name is Joe Joyce and I'm the author of 1691, a novel, which, as the title indicates, is an account of that fateful year, written as fiction, but sticking closely to the facts insofar as we can know them. My interest in the period stems from the fact that I grew up in Aughrim, County Galway, scene of the decisive battle which led on to the Treaty of Limerick and set the course for Ireland's future. 1691 was the third and final year of the Williamite War in Ireland, also known in Irish as Cúgaimh Dá Rí, the War of the Two Kings between the Catholic James II and his Protestant usurper William of Orange, or William III. The war was over who controlled Ireland, but also England, Scotland and Wales, and it was the Western Front in a European war between Louis XIV of France and a grand alliance of most of his neighbours, which was also led by William of Orange. The headline events of the war in Ireland fall neatly into one a year: the Siege of Derry in the spring and summer of 1689, the Battle of the Boyne in the summer of 1690, and the final siege and Treaty of Limerick in the autumn of 1691. The Boyne is rightly regarded as the most important event of that war. It was of huge symbolic and strategic importance because it gave control of Dublin to William and his supporters. But it was not a knockout blow, as is evident from the fact that William failed to maintain the momentum of that victory. He pursued James's army, the Jacobites, to Limerick, but the city successfully repulsed his attacks and forced him to withdraw and abandon his hopes of bringing the war in Ireland to an end in 1690. His forces also failed to seize Athlone in 1690, the other major crossing point on the River Shannon, which left the Jacobites holding everywhere west of the Shannon, as well as Kerry and parts of Cork as the war went into another year. Their situation was of course far from ideal, but there were positives too. The Jacobite army remained largely intact. The successful defence of Limerick against William was a huge boost to morale, and more aid was coming from France in the new year. But there were also deep divisions in the camp. Richard Talbot, King James's representative in Ireland, and the leader of the country's Catholics in the years leading up to the war, wanted to negotiate a settlement while they remained undefeated. Patrick Sarsfield, whose famous raid at Ballyneety had helped to end William's siege of Limerick, wanted to fight on. Both sides sent emissaries to James, who had gone back to Paris after the Boyne, to argue their case. Not for the first time, James dithered and tried to appease both. He kept Talbot as his representative and elevated him from Earl to Duke. He also promoted Sarsfield to Major General and gave him the title of Earl of Lucan. But neither was given overall military command. That was reserved for the French general, the Marquis de Saint-Roux, who had made his name persecuting French Protestants, or Huguenots, after Louis XIV had taken away their civil and religious rights in France in 1685. The new year of large-scale military operations in Ireland began in May 1691 with the arrival of the French general and his two deputies, along with a substantial convoy of supplies. Meanwhile, the Williamites gathered in Mullingar to move westwards. As the army on the offensive, there were several options open to them. Their Dutch commander, Godard de Ginkle, decided to try and cross the Shannon at Athlone, hoping to cut the Jacobite territory in half. He succeeded against the odds after a 10-day siege which dropped an enormous quantity of explosives and cannon shot on the small town on the western bank of the river. Although seen as unimaginative and stolid by many of his own general staff, Ginkle turned out repeatedly to have that quality later identified by Napoleon as the most important in a general: luck. Stung by the loss of Athlone and against the advice of most of his generals, the French general Saint-Roux decided to make a stand some 20 miles west of the village of Aughrim. It was an ideal site in many respects. It's a hill running roughly north to south. It overlooked a marsh through which the enemy would have to trudge and then fight its way up a slow gradient against well-defended ditches. Saint-Roux's plan worked perfectly when both armies came face to face on Sunday, July the 12th. The energy-sapping attacks across the marsh by the Williamite infantry were pushed back repeatedly. Fierce cavalry clashes on firm ground at the southern end of the battlefield also saw the Jacobite cavalry under Sarsfield holding firm. The cavalry normally fought on both wings of a front, and the Williamite cavalry was hampered at the northern end of the line. There was only enough firm ground for a couple of horsemen to advance side by side, and that was covered by a garrison placed in a ruined castle beside the village. There had been relatively little fighting at that end of the battlefield during the day, and some of the Jacobite defenders had been moved elsewhere as reinforcements were required. The Williamite cavalry, under a French Huguenot general, finally attacked in this area in what amounted to a last throw of the dice. It broke through the depleted defences. Seeing this from his vantage point on the hill, General Saint-Roux led a cavalry charge to halt their advance and was killed by a cannonball. His death is generally seen as the turning point of the battle, as Richard Murphy put it in his epic poem, The Battle of Aughrim, and I quote, "Chance, skill and treachery all hit the mark, just when the sun's rod tipped the altar hill." Unquote. At the time, though, it was far from clear what had happened and what caused the sudden collapse in the Jacobite lines. Indeed, the Williamite general Ginkell wrote to his political masters the following day, saying that he was trying to confirm reports that the French general had been killed. In the aftermath of the battle, the collapse and defeat were blamed on reasons ranging from treachery to Saint-Roux's secrecy about his plans, to his supposed exclusion of Sarsfield from the battlefield, and to stories that the castle's garrison had run out of ammunition because of a mix-up between French and Irish muskets. The battle did continue after Saint-Roux's death, but the scales had been rebalanced in the Williamites' favour. Their cavalry was now literally cutting through the Jacobite infantry from the side. Horsemen against foot soldiers, probably the worst nightmare of any general at the time. Sarsfield cavalry was now under attack from both sides and could only try to pull back and, as tradition has it, cover the retreat. But there was no escape for thousands of infantrymen, nor indeed for hundreds or perhaps even thousands of camp followers, including women and children, and sutlers or suppliers who were caught up in the subsequent mayhem. A Danish soldier on the Williamite side, Andreas Claudianus, described the aftermath, an open quote, "To put it candidly, the blood from the bodies of the dead and wounded sieved out onto the ground, thus inundating the plains so that you could hardly move without slipping. This revolting spectacle remained unchanged for days. Oh, what an awful sight, impossible to imagine for anyone who has not witnessed it himself." Unquote. Nobody knows for sure how many died in the rout that Sunday evening on Aughrim Hill, possibly 3,000 to 4,000. In all, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 died during the battle and its aftermath. The Williamites too had suffered serious casualties during the earlier stages of the battle. The majority of casualties, however, were Irish infantrymen, but the officer class certainly did not escape either. Proportionately, twice as many officers as soldiers were killed, which was not unusual at the time, as officers led from the front and were often easily identified by their dress. As well as the French commander Saint-Roux, 2 English Jacobite generals were among the captured. Sarsfield's brother-in-law, Lord Galway, was murdered after he had surrendered, and another Burke brother-in-law captured. Talbot's natural son Mark was wounded but survived, and the list of dead and captured on the Jacobite side included O'Kellys, O'Neills, Dillons, O'Moores, Butlers, O'Keefes, Dailies, and so on. There was no doubt among the victors and the vanquished at the time and for a century and more afterwards that the Battle of Aughrim was the decisive engagement of the Williamite War. Its anniversary, the 12th of July, was the date celebrated by the victorious Williamites, and in effect it still is, although that date is now associated with the Battle of the Boyne, which was actually fought on the 1st of July under the calendar in force at the time. After Aughrim, the Jacobites withdrew to Galway and Limerick, both important ports which kept their lifelines to France open. Galway was besieged and negotiated a deal with the Williamites. The war's disastrous effects on its economy through inflation and the disruption of its normal trade with France and Spain, and especially the disruption of its lucrative sugar business with the Caribbean, meant its leading citizens had been eager for peace for more than a year. Limerick was a different matter. True, the Jacobites were demoralised, but the city's defences were in better shape than they had been the previous year when they withstood William's siege, and more aid was on its way from France, practically guaranteeing that they could hold out into 1692. But a series of events on top of Auckland's defeat ground down the city's will to resist. They included the death of Butcher Talbot, probably from a stroke, although the nervous atmosphere in the city encouraged rumours of poisoning, the relentless bombardment of the city with cannonballs, mortars and incendiary bombs, the arrest of Sarsfield's main adviser Henry Luttrell on suspicions of treachery, and the failure of the promised French fleet to arrive. It did eventually, days after the treaty was signed. But the final straw came after the Williamites succeeded in crossing the Shannon and encircling the city, cutting it off from its food supplies and its cavalry in Clare. The move culminated in the massacre of several hundred Jacobite soldiers when the drawbridge on Thomond Bridge was razed as they fled back into the city, and they were left at the mercy, or more accurately, the lack of mercy, of the encircling forces. The treaty negotiated to end the war was not a bad deal on paper, guaranteeing to Sarsfield, who was now in effective command of the Jacobites, what he most wanted: the ability to take the army to France and continue the fight from there. What turned out to be the 9 Years' War on the continent had not yet reached its halfway point, and France could yet have been victorious. Indeed, there was a specific plan for the Jacobite army from Ireland, augmented by significant French forces, to invade England in the summer of 1692. True to their name, the Wild Geese had every intention of returning the following year. As we know, it never happened. The invasion was thwarted by an Anglo-Dutch naval victory over the French navy off the coast of Normandy. The Wild Geese were subsumed into the French army, and many of those who had fought on both sides in Ireland, including Sarsfield himself, were to die on continental battlefields in the following years as the 9 Years' War continued. The terms of the Treaty of Limerick guaranteed the religious and property rights of all those in Jacobite territory at the time it was signed, but it was abrogated by Protestant parliaments, not quite before the ink was dry on it, but soon enough after the 9 Years' War ended in 1697. Between those killed at Auckland and those who left for France with the Wild Geese, Ireland had lost many of its old Gaelic and Norman ruling families. Those who survived the war and stayed in Ireland found themselves fighting endless legal battles over the treaty's terms, until the penal laws finally ground them down, and Ireland's subsequent fate was sealed. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and if you have any comments or queries, you can contact me through my website, joejoyce.ie.